Well, it is fight week. The countdown is on, and this Saturday night at the K2 Arena in Crawley in West Sussex, Quest Boxing League returns for an absolutely massive night of championship boxing, headlined by British Super Middleweight champion Lee Cannon defending his title up against Max Chart. And today, in our brand new episode of Before the Bell, myself and Joey Knight, we're going to be talking about all of the huge title fights coming up on this weekend's show. Plus, we're going to be covering some of the other exciting fighters that are on the bill. And Joey, great to see you. Last time out, obviously, at the Epsom Downs Racecourse in Surrey. We introduced the After the Bell, a fantastic review of all of the great fights on that night. But I've got to say, I am so excited about this Saturday's show at K2. It's got an absolute feast of championship action, and it's going to be really good to look at the fights, review them, and really kind of get an opinion from two people looking in who know the fighters very, very well, and give those who are coming to the show kind of an insight into what to expect, who we potentially could, who think is going to win and why, and really just kind of cover all bases. So, you know, first and foremost, last time out, great show at Epsom. How are you?
Yeah, really good, Blake. Thanks for having me on again. And obviously, the After the Bell show that we done had really, really good feedback from everyone that had watched it. Everyone was enjoying that, so hopefully that's we keep up. In terms of this show coming up, I'm so excited for this show, and one of the reasons why I'm massively excited for this show is with Quest, we always know what we're going to get 50-50 fights, we're going to get a lot of action, it's going to be a sprint rather than a marathon in most cases, and that juice fights. But one thing that the Quest does, which I'm yet to sort of see any similar shows be able to do to the same extent and in the same amount of detail, is it showcases a lot of background and stories and narratives on these fighters. So when we look at this card, for example, there's boys that are boxing on this card that have boxed on your shows for nearly 10 years. Some that have boxed on there for over 10 years. I look at Lee Cannon, obviously Max Chart, a veteran of the league, and the list goes on. A lot of the names and personalities we're seeing, the hardcore fans of the shows have actually had an opportunity to watch a lot of these fighters build and grow and develop for the best part of a decade, you know? So that's one thing that makes this show a mouthful one for me, as somewhat of a hardcore fan of Quest, someone that's been there and done it around the circuit multiple years, is seeing some of the fighters that we're going to see showcasing their talents on the night build over fights, months, years. So, yeah, that's it. I'm really, really looking forward.
Absolutely. Like you say, some of these guys have been doing this for a long, long time. And for some of them, as in our main event, Lee Cannon, he said, you know, before this fight was sort of announced, I've got one more fight, one more big night for me. I feel like I need to go out on a big fight. And when this particular fight was made against Max Chart, you know, they don't come any bigger than this. So, as I say, it's exciting to talk about it. It gives the fans a little bit of sort of meat on the bones in terms of they may be coming to watch one particular fighter and not really know anything about some of the other stars of the competition if they haven't been following it. So I think this is going to be a really good opportunity to analyse, dissect, give people a reason to come and not only watch the fighters that they know, but the other ones on the bill and why they're important fights, what to look forward to, and why we think these are going to be exciting fights. So I think we start with the main event. And as I say, as main events go, this is an unbelievable fight. You've got the British Super Middleweight champion, Lee Cannon. He is taking on the former undefeated national light heavyweight champion, Max Chart. Both well known in the competition. Both of them bring something to this fight that means that equally, either one of these guys could walk away, either Cannon still champion or Max Chart, the new British Super Middleweight champion. So first and foremost, let's look at Lee Cannon, the champion, the defending champion. What do you know about Lee? What have you seen of him over his career?
I've probably got a significant advantage most, because when I was actively boxing myself, I've shared the ring with Lee many, many times in sparring. It's very hard, and that's not just because I was a lighter weight than him. Actually, funny enough, Lee started off competing welterweight.
Yeah, down at welterweight was his first weight.
Yeah, he's gone up through the weight classes, through the divisions. He's always kept and carried his power. That's one thing. And And Lee is, I don't want to use the word underrated because I think that could sound almost like a backhanded compliment against Lee, but Lee is the sort of fighter that I think when you get in a ring and share a ring with Lee, you'll see just how vast his skill set actually is. He can fight on the front, fight on the back, he can fight orthodox, he can fight southpaw. As I say, a big puncher, and he's shown that a lot in fights gone by. Very recently, you know, knocking out Maide the Degby, who's obviously another name that is very familiar on the league, and a fighter that I really rate in the Degby. And Lee dismantled the Degby in his last fight, and I think that came as a shock to a lot of people because you had that fight and you were looking at maybe fairly similar to how you're looking at this fight, almost like a passing of the guard type fight. Younger, fresher man against the old, experienced veteran in Lee Cannon. I mean old by boxing terms, not in life. But yeah, and obviously another thing that is definitely worth mentioning with Lee, and I know he won't mind me talking about this, is obviously Lee has had his troubles outside of the ring. You know that he had to take a layoff. He was diagnosed with cancer, and obviously very, very fortunately beat his battle with cancer, and that was a big thing. And he sort of came back. He fought Marcus Stevenson, who again is a name that everyone knows what a tough opponent Stevenson is. That fight was dedicated, and I think had money going towards raising money for cancer. So a really, really, really good bloke inside and outside of the ring in Lee Cannon. And definitely, like you say, whether they're a supporter, Lee, Max, of any other fighter on the show, a fighter that most fans in the venue are going to really want to get behind, as are a lot of fighters on the show. So Lee Cannon is, to be honest now, the way things are going, he's definitely the most experienced fighter on the show. He's had something like over 30 fights, shows.
I was looking back through this and, you know, I interviewed Lee recently and I was chatting about, you know, the fights that he's had. And then when you delve back in, because I know it sounds crazy, but you forget about some of the fighters and some of the fights and some of the big names that he's faced across his career from, like you say, starting at welterweight and then moving through the weights to light middleweight. I mean, when Lee started, I never would have thought that he would end up as a super middleweight. But he's really sort of grown into it. I mean, height-wise, obviously, he's not the tallest super middleweight by any stretch of the imagination. But, like you say, in his last performances, we've seen with that extra weight has come extra power. And I know that Lee has said, you know, when I interviewed him for this fight, he said, you know, I used to move around a lot, throw shots from weird angles. You know, I never really used to hold my feet and let my power go. And people in the gym were telling me, you know, you can punch, you know, you've got power, but it never really came across in fights because my style of boxing was totally different back then. But now I'm holding my feet, I'm planting them, you know, I'm letting the shots go. And in sparring, you know, I'm putting people down with 16-ounce gloves on, people in much higher weight divisions than myself. The power is there and it's only now coming through. And I wish I'd done this sooner in my career. So, you know, for me, if I look at this fight, and I've looked at it hard for a long, long time and weighed up the options because I know both of them very well. I know what each of them brings to the table. Lee, he's matured, he's experienced, he's been there, done that. He won't be fazed by facing somebody like Max Chart. You know, I look at this fight and think, well, okay, so for Lee Cannon, he's brought that power up now. He's strong, he's experienced, he's the champion, he's coming into this fight confident. Lee Cannon has to land those big power shots on Max Chart. Lee Cannon has to find a way to get inside, land that big, big overhand right that he's become sort of synonymous with. And he's got the power, and he's shown that he's got the power to hurt his opponents. You know, like I say, the spectacular knockout against Maide Degby. And in previous fights, you know, one from way back where he sort of he put Jimmy Hogney down in the fight, and Hogney, unbelievably durable, unbelievably tough, and you didn't see anybody do that to Jimmy Hogney at the time. So for me, Cannon has the power. He's got the power to hurt Chart. Can he land on Max Chart? For me, this fight hinges on if Max Chart boxes like he did in the first 4 rounds against Josh O'Brien, you know, sticks behind the jab, throws the right hand, in and out, doesn't hold his feet, doesn't stay in the pocket too long, doesn't see the red mist and start to trade, then I think Max Chart has more than enough ability to keep it long and outbox Lee Cannon over the 5 rounds if it goes that far. But, and this is the massive but, if Max Charles decides to get in the moment, the crowd are going wild, they're exchanging shots, and Max Chart holds his feet too long, stays in the pocket too long, and starts to exchange, then I think he could be in trouble, because we've seen it against the likes of Brady Lesser, Ace Adams. Those are the sort of types of caliber that Max Chart has fought. They both fought high-level opponents, but when Max Chart has stood and traded, he's taken shots, he's been shaken, he is teak tough, but, we've seen that in the past, that is his sort of chink in the armour. If Max holds his feet and lets Lee sort of unload shots and he's in range, I think he could be bang in trouble. But equally, if Max Chart boxes, stays out of danger, again, it might be the fight perfect for Max, that he wins comfortably on points, looks amazing, and sort of cements his legacy as, one of the best in the competition. So for you, obviously, you've talked about Cannon's power, you've talked about what you know of him, but what does Max Chart bring to this fight that you think, well, if he executes that game plan, Max Chart could dethrone Lee Cannon?
Max Chart, in my opinion, is a throwback. He's a fighter that the sort of initial attributes spring to people's mind don't paint the picture of just how good Max Chart is. Again, I spoke about the ability to switch it. Max Chart's another one that you see come out in Southpaw Dogs. He can do a bit of everything, Max Chart. He's from the White Dog Gym, which have produced over the years on your shows countless champions. Really, really good fighters, tough fighters. That's one thing you can credit every single fighter comes out of that gym, teak tough.
Yeah.
Fit as a fiddle, raring, ready to go in there and absolutely go to war. And like you say, seen in a couple of fights against the likes of Ace Adams, I remember most notably actually fought on that show. It was up at Troxy. We see in that fight Max Chart go down, but we also, I think, saw him put Ace Adams down in that fight.
He did, yeah. He sort of came back and showed, it was, I remember ringside watching that fight, and literally, I can't remember a fight previous to that I was that excited ringside where I didn't really know what to do, because I was sat watching that fight, Ace Adams caught Max with a body shot, Max went down, then Max came back and kind of rallied, and, it was, he put Ace Adams down, and you were like, this is unbelievable. I mean, like, real kind of, like you say, throwback kind of Hollywood-esque stroke. He's down. Where does this fight go? And I think in a lot of Max's previous fights where he's lost, for example, the Ace Adams fight, he came back from traveling for that fight. It wasn't the ideal preparation. And I think that in some of the fights that Max has lost, it's not down to him not being the better fighter. It's basically down to the fact that his preparations haven't been quite right. Whereas for this one, I know that he's sort of openly said, I'm in a great space physically, mentally. When I interviewed him sort of earlier this week, he looked good at the weight. He said, I've made the weight easy. It's not been like a struggle, where so many fighters, you say after the fight, I really struggled to get to that weight. It drained me a little bit. That wasn't my best performance. Whereas I think with both of them, Lee Cannon as well, he said, I'm good at the weight. I've just got a couple of pounds to lose. I'm feeling strong. I'm feeling so. When you're listening to that and you're sort of hearing the positivity from both camps saying, no excuses, no stone left unturned. I am coming into this fight confident, physically, mentally ready, and I know what I've got to do. And it is, like I say, for me, I could sit here with you and argue both ways as to why Lee Cannon could win this fight, why Max Chart could win this fight, why they would lose this fight. But ultimately, as they say in boxing, it's a pick'em. It's a 50-50 fight where I could and you could easily argue and convince somebody who doesn't know either Max Chart or Lee Cannon why they're going to win this fight. And you would come away from that going, oh, well, they're going to win that fight because of that reason. But ultimately, the hairs on your back of your neck are going to go up. These guys are going to make their ring walk at the K2. And I've spoken to so many Quest champions, former Queensberry champions, people who just follow the show, who message on socials saying, what do you think about this one? Who wins this? Is it Chart? Is it Cannon? Do you think it's going to be a knockout? who's got the power. And I think we're forgetting as well, when Max Charp came onto the scene, when he first made his debut in Queensberry and also in Quest, he was known as a puncher. You know, he put Chris Jones down in his debut for actually at K2 Arena many years ago. He put Chris Jones down. You know, he put the likes of Frankie Lloyd down. He knocked out Ricky Peacock. He was known as a puncher. He was known that these fights don't go to the judges. And Lee Cannon didn't have that throughout his career, but now has that. So, you know, I can't, if somebody said, pick a winner, put your money on it, put your house on it, who would you pick? I would say the same thing that I've said to you in this. If Max Charp boxes, he wins the fight. If he gets involved in a tear-up, potentially he's going to lose the fight. So I don't know how you see it, but ultimately, if I said to you, come on, Joey, don't sit on the fence. You know, I know that you know Lee from sort of, you were gym mates many years ago. I know you know Max from, obviously, like you said, the sort of the Ace Adams fight through to his exploits in Quest. Who would you pick if you had to sort of make an educated guess and say, from my experience, I'm going to go with him because of this?
Mate, I'm going to be Zamarsi because it's an absolute coin toss. It's so hard to pick a winner. The problem, the issue I have with picking a winner here is that the fight can go a couple of different ways. And it won't necessarily go the way that we perceive it to go in terms of how things play out. So you could say straight away, well, Lee Cannon's got the experience. Of course, you look at the amount of fights that Lee's had. Of course, he's got the experience. Let's not pretend Max isn't experienced. Max is not only experienced in fights, he's also come through a lot of sort of turbulent situations in fights. I remember him having his nose broke in one of the fights that he came through, that he still came back to do really well in. And obviously the fight against Josh O'Brien last time out at the K2, brilliant event, one that I was at supporting a good friend of mine, Seb Hallett. And in that fight against Josh O'Brien, Max started off, you know, like a sort of younger, lighter fighter than we've even seen, sort of thing. He was peppering him, picking the jabs, and a little bit of concentration, in my opinion. I don't think Max, I'm maybe saying that, started to maybe slip as the rounds went on, and that's where Josh O'Brien came into the fight slightly, albeit, that being said, I think that Max, you know, obviously won quite comfortably. So it's so hard to give a judgment on who wins this fight. And the reason I'm sort of steering away from giving one is because I'm being completely honest here. It's nothing, you know, there'll be other fights that I will give opinions on, but the reason I'm steering away from it is because I honestly do believe there wouldn't be anything calculated behind me giving a pick on this fight, because I do genuinely believe it is the flip of a coin. But one thing I could guarantee you in this fight, plenty of fights, you look at boxing, right? We look at big matchups. Let's say, for example, Spence against Crawley. We have our perceptions on how things could go. You can never quite gauge exactly what it would be. So you could look at a fight and you could say, well, that's got war. Go for it. It's going to be an absolute war between these two. And then sometimes the two fighters get in the ring and what plays out isn't seen. Sometimes it can be a more technical affair, and boxing skill can be on show, but both men can be a little bit hesitant. This fight is as close to a guarantee as life, death, and taxes. That is how close to a guarantee this fight is. This is going to be on, because whether both men would like to admit it or not, and this isn't really down to concentration, but more down to the fact that everyone that boxes on these shows, they box because they love boxing.
Mm.
They're boxing fans themselves. And you know that once the crowd kicks in, which Max will be bringing a big crowd, Lee will be bringing a big crowd as he always does. Once the crowd noise kicks in, the atmosphere takes hold, it's going to turn into a war. It really, really is this fight. So once it gets to that stage, boxing ability, I'm not saying it's not relevant, to some extent it goes out the window. And then it's who has more heart, who has more resilience, and get the job done. So you're asking me to pick someone, it's just going to be too hard for me to give an answer in this fight. But I suppose that's what makes the best fights. The fact that no one can sit here and definitively say Cannon wins, Charp wins, it's just too hard to pick.
No, I think it's, I always say with boxing, it's head and heart. You know, your head says one particular fighter, your heart says sometimes a completely different thing. And for me, what I always do is, not just with Quest, but with fights like you mentioned outside of Quest, you know, the big fights in the professional ranks, I always look at each fighter, I look at their previous opponents, and then I wonder how, if their opponent hasn't fought it. So, for example, if you looked at Lee Cannon's last opponent, Mire Dedegbe, obviously knocked Dedegbe out in emphatic fashion. How would Max Chart do against Mire Dedegbe? And equally, if Lee Cannon was fighting Josh O'Brien, how would that fight go? I know they're different styles, but you kind of then look at it and go, well, actually, and you see the fight from a different perspective, and you say, oh, hold on a second. Yeah, actually, no. I think that maybe Chart might have struggled, or I might think that, Cannon might have found it a little bit difficult because of the styles. I mean, like I say, they're different fighters, Cannon and Chart. They bring different things to the table for this fight. But ultimately, like we've said, this fight could go either way. This fight could end with a knockout either way, and I wouldn't be surprised. This fight could go to points, and either of them could win. I wouldn't be surprised. So, like I say, it's all to play for. It's Lee Cannon's last fight. He said, this is my last fight. He said, I'm retiring as champion. I've seen it. I've visualized it. I know. And equally, Max Chart has also said, I cannot see anything other than my hand being raised and becoming the British Super Middleweight champion. It would be a dream come true, and I cannot wait. And the last thing I'm going to put into this, which we haven't touched on, obviously Lee Cannon, like we mentioned, has gone up the weights from welterweight to light middleweight to super middleweight. Max Chart was at light heavyweight last time. This is the first time Max Chart has come down to 12 stone since the first Lee Adams fight, Ace Adams fight. So then again, you've got two different scales. Chart is the naturally bigger man. He's coming down to super middleweight. Cannon, push comes to shove, could probably make middleweight again. Maybe even light middleweight, possibly, might be a struggle. But what I'm saying is that, Chart is physically the bigger fighter in there. Whether that looks like it in the ring on the night is a different thing, because Cannon's put on some muscle since his days campaigning at the lighter weights. But, like I say, we could talk about it all day. We could tell each other. We could probably even convince each other a different outcome talking through this. But ultimately, it's a classic Quest Boxing League showdown, 50-50, best versus the best. And I think, the winners are going to be the fans next Saturday night at K2, because you are in for an absolutely barnstormer. So even if you're not coming to see Max Chart and Lee Cannon, you're looking at some of the other fights that we're going to talk about, you'll want to stay for this fight and you'll want to see it play out, because it is that good a fight. So, yeah. Next up, I've got to talk about, it's the national light welterweight title. It's a vacant title. The two fighters who are challenging for it, you've obviously got Ben Taylor up against Dean Conroy. Last time out, we saw down in Brighton, Ben Taylor make his return. He hadn't boxed for 5 years. He's a very, very experienced fighter. He's had a lot of amateur experience. He boxed in Queensbury Boxing League many years ago against a fighter called Tony Clemmy, won that fight, came back, home show in Brighton, fighting a very experienced fighter in Kieran Trussell, and it was a fantastic performance. And he's up against, probably to many of the show's fans, an unknown quantity in Dean Conroy, who is a very, very skillful fighter. He's quick, he's fast. He's naturally, I would say, he's campaigned at sort of at super featherweight, lightweight, and he's coming up to light welterweight. But I know you watched the footage of Ben Taylor for obviously the fight in Brighton. So, break him down as an opponent.
Really, really impressed by what first thing that I asked you straight away. And it was almost a rhetorical question, because I knew the answer was, this boy's had amateur fights then, yeah? Because straight away I was looking at him, and not necessarily stylistically, because although he was good on his feet, sometimes you'd stereotype the typical amateur style of in and out point scoring. And I'd say that he's got a bit more sting on his punches than that, sits down on his shots. But in terms of how well schooled you could tell that he's had a vast amount of experience in the past. That obviously came across. Surprised to hear it had a 5-year layoff. So that's something that I think, if I was his opponent, I'm going to be trying to draw a bit of confidence from. But from what I had seen of him there, a very well-schooled fighter, a confident fighter, one that went in there knowing exactly what he needs to do, and obviously made, I don't want to say easy work, done a really good job in the fight that I saw of him. Also, I mentioned before, a friend of mine, Seb, had it. I know that Seb goes to spar with Taylor, and I've heard sort of going from Seb also, said it's a tough round, very, very well skilled. So I think, again, in this fight, you're going to see a real talent in terms of Ben Taylor. But the interesting thing, maybe you'll be able to tell me because I haven't seen as much of the opponent, is what does his opponent bring to the night, to make this a clash that Ben Taylor's really going to have his work cut out for him.
Yeah, I mean, I know that sort of Dean Conroy, as I say, he's campaigned at lower weights. He's coming up. I mean, he is, as I say, at 10 stone. You know, he's sort of, that's what he's campaigning at now. He's fast. You know, he's sharp. He's one of those fighters, though, that he can either look $1 million and look very, very good, or if he's not quite motivated for the task, you know, he doesn't shine. But I know I've spoken to him, and I've sort of said to Dean, you know, this is a great fight. You know, it's the national title. It's a vacant title. You're up against a fighter who is technically very, very good in Ben Taylor. He's talented. He's strong. I mean, I think Ben's only around about 5'5", 5'6", so he's short, he's compact, he's stocky. But Dean Conroy is really, really up for this fight. Dean Conroy is sort of saying, this is a massive opportunity for me. This is a huge fight. And, you know, I've seen the footage of Taylor, and yeah, I fancy it. I think I've got the skills to make it really frustrating for him. He won't have fought anybody, you know, that's as fast as me. You know, Taylor, like you say, has got that amateur pedigree. It's a really, really tough fight. I mean, I would go with Taylor on this, only because I've seen more of Taylor firsthand and I know what he brings to the table. But, you know, for Conroy, yeah, when you come into a fight and you haven't got a huge burden of expectation on you, you haven't got the pressure of like, you're the favorite, or, you know, you've got this. Sometimes as a fighter, you can come into a fight and just think, you know, there's no pressure. I haven't built myself up to, you know, too much in this fight. I'm an unknown quantity. I'm going to cause a shock. And I think that when you're relaxed, and you know yourself from boxing, if you're flowing, you're relaxed, you're not sort of too tense, you can put on a completely different performance. Whereas sometimes the nerves get to fighters, and because, you know, it means so much to them, and they've hyped it up, and people have hyped it up, you know, they don't perform to their best ability.
Perspective, nothing can motivate you for a fight like knowing you're going in there against a really, really... I remember earlier on, the Queensberry days, I fought, and at the time, Troy Newman had been knocking people out in fights, dropping and stopping much bigger men than myself. And I remember that in terms of incentive going into a fight to massively motivate you and realize, like, you need to be so switched on, so sharp, that can draw the best performance of fighters' careers out of them. So I think if you're Conroy and you're looking at the skill of Ben Taylor, that's definitely going to be something that's able to massively motivate you in this fight. And then from a flip side of it, look at the fact that, we know, so people that are maybe casual fans or maybe don't watch much boxing would hear amateur boxing, and they would think maybe, that's what he says on the tin, it's amateur. You really ain't. Amateur boxing's a really, really good pedigree if you go up in the levels. And obviously, when I look at Ben Taylor, he looks like he was at the sort of higher echelon of that level. So anyone that watches boxing straight away will go, well, you'd fancy a good amateur. Queensberry and Quest specifically has taught us one thing, is that these good amateurs don't always come out on top. Now, I fought a very experienced amateur myself on the league before, and obviously managed to put off a win in that fight, albeit a very close fight. And the amount of times that I have seen really good sort of amateur prospects, standout talents come in on the league, and I myself have been guilty of thinking, well, he'll have too much for this fella because this bloke's only boxed on license or something like that. You actually see upsets in these fights, because I think that one thing, and I'm not doubting that Ben Taylor is just to play sort of devil's advocate on this, one thing that have to gain very, very quickly fighting on all shows is a level of toughness, a level of having to be able to deal with the pressure that comes with it. Some of these amateur shows, I know they've changed the rules slightly now, but you're wearing bigger gloves, head guards a lot of the time in years gone by. And also, not only that, must have been to amateur shows yourself when there's attendance.
Yeah, it's a different, like, you add in the crowd, the atmosphere, the lights, the cameras, and you look at that, and some fighters, probably like you, thrive on that and, really, really absorb it all and and raise your game. Whereas, you speak to some fighters afterwards and they said, yeah, I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't ready for the crowd and the lights and the TV. And it was a little bit like I didn't have my head in the game in that second round because I was still fazed by it all. But yeah, I don't think either of them are going to be fazed by this. I don't think either of them are going to have a problem coming out in the K2 arena to a big crowd. I think it's going to really sort of motivate them both. So it is, like I say, it's another great fight. I would edge towards Ben Taylor, but like I say, I wouldn't be surprised if there was an upset.
I'd edge towards Ben Taylor, and that's purely because that's the fighter I've seen more. Seen a little bit of a clip of Dean Conroy, but haven't seen as much of him as I had Ben Taylor. And obviously, I've heard glowing reviews and whatnot about Ben Taylor. But for Dean Conroy, what I would say, very, very important, you come up against an experienced, skilled fighter like this. And this is just my advice for what it's worth. It might not be worth much, but know what you're good at and have a very, very strict game in the fight. Don't go in there thinking, I'll have a little look at him and see, whatever. No. Have a game plan. Go into the fight, which I'm sure your corner team and your coaches around you will come up with when you've worked on in the gym. Try and stick with that as strategically and as strict as possible, because I think that as a fighter, knowing what you're good at and knowing what you don't excel in, actually strength, especially against, some of these amateur boys, to draw reference to pro boxing again, yeah. Anthony Joshua against Usyk. Anthony Joshua's biggest downfall in that fight was he tried to box the boxer. He had to go in there and have a boxing match with Usyk, and it's like, try and do maybe what we see Daddy will do, or try and do against Usyk, albeit it didn't work, but try and do what you are good at as a fighter, rather than going, right, that's what he's good at, let me try and match him. Because against a good former amateur boxer, good pedigree like Ben Taylor, it's probably unlikely you're going to be able to match him at that. So do what has worked for a lot of fighters on Quest in the past, in terms of going, okay, I can give you that trait, I can give you that attribute, that experience, whatever. But I know what I'm going to do. I know what I'm good at. And I'm going to go in there and try as hard as I can to execute that. And I think that for what it's worth, that's where I see him getting the most success in this fight.
Absolutely. Yeah, like you say, you don't want to box the boxer if you're the fighter. So it's fascinating. There's so many fights on this. We'll try and go through them. We're obviously not going to give them as much detail as the chart Cannon showdown. But going back, we obviously talked about the veterans, Max Chart, Lee Cannon, how long they've both been in the competition. And up next, the regional cruiserweight title. Matt Hilliker faces Simeon Dennis. And again, both of these guys have been in the competition a long time. They've been boxing under the Queensberry and now the Quest banner. Both of these guys are coming into this fight off the back of really, really good wins. Last time out, Hilliker stopped Ty Saunders in a fight that I actually probably going into that fight maybe thought that Ty Saunders was going to be a really hard fight for Hilliker, because Matt Hilliker, if you've seen Matt Hilliker, he's a big, strong, solid guy. When I say big, strong and solid, I mean big, strong and solid. But many, many years ago, he had an amateur sort of background. So, when he first started boxing and I was promoting him, he was on his toes. He boxed totally different how I thought Matt Hilliker would box. He boxed like an amateur, up on his toes, lovely style, boxing, working his way in, throwing his shot, good shot selection. His style of boxing didn't fit his physical attributes for me.
Stuart Lamming?
He fought Stuart Lamming, yeah, and that was...
on that show, it just, when you said about him bouncing a little bit, it came into my head. I was thinking, I feel like I remember that fight boxing Stuart Lamming, and I remember being very impressed by him then, thinking that actually style maybe doesn't suit your build almost, but in a very complimentary way.
Yeah, exactly. It's they don't fit together, but, and this is obviously a big but, when he last fought at the York Hall, Matt Hilliker, a few months ago, and when he fought Ty Saunders, who's a tall, rangy boxer, good skill set, he looked a totally different fighter. He came out with purpose. He was aggressive. It almost looked like from the get-go, I just want to take your head off. And he caught Saunders with an absolutely peach. I think it was a left hook, bust his nose. Saunders was sort of in banging trouble, and he ended up stopping him. And it was a really, really quick fight. And I looked at that fight, I thought, that wasn't the Matt Hilliker that I'd seen before. And it was almost like he turned a corner and knew he had to be, more aggressive, more purposeful, come out, really put it on his opponent and not try and sort of, punch his way to victory, and which I think he'd done sort of previously. Whereas Simeon Dennis, on the other side of things, he's a veteran. He's been there. He's done it. His brother Mark has won titles at sort of cruiserweight and heavyweight. And Simeon Dennis, he's southpaw. He's awkward. He's stylish. He can make any fighter look ordinary. He's a nightmare to box, in my opinion, not only because he's southpaw, but because of his style. And I think, style-wise, it's a really, really fascinating fight.
Yeah, I think Simeon Dennis, again, another fighter that obviously I've been lucky enough to box on the same show as before, and a fighter that I do very much rate. Mentioned about his brother Mark, who's obviously go down really as one of the best fighters to ever fight on these shows. Really, really good fighter, always an entertaining fight, very explosive, won through the weights, came back from sort of troubles outside of the ring in terms of his medical health and whatnot. And always put on good performances. And the first thing you would think when you look at Simeon is maybe that they would be built in the same mold. But although they're very, very talented, very different fighters to me. Simeon Dennis, obviously a southpaw, and a fighter that, like you said, can make onto shots. I notice about Simeon Dennis, when he throws his jab, he'll double up on it. Sometimes you'll see a triple jab coming from him, and he's got good footwork for a big man as well. Can be stepping on that back foot and walking people onto it. So I think when you mention the fact that Matt Hilliker came out with a sort of no-nonsense approach in that fight and sort of went for the jugular straight away, what I would counter that by saying is it's often horses for courses, isn't it? Styles make fights.
Absolutely.
Might play into Simeon's hands if he does try and do that. Then at the same time, shorter rounds, small rings in comparison to sort of Olympic-sized rings that we see, which obviously for the fans, and me and you included in that, make for really, really entertaining fights. So not saying he would run Simeon Dennis, but there's nowhere to run. There's nowhere to hide in these fights. So although it's very good that, you can box on the back foot and you can do some work and outwit people, from experience, I know there's always going to be a time in that 4 or 5 rounds you need to plant your feet, to let shots go. Yeah. But I do think that depending on how often Matt Hilliker responds southpaws, that's saying Simeon Dennis is going to have going in his favour. Also, just thinking of Simeon Dennis off the top of my head, very good right hook. Well, I've seen him catch multiple opponents with. So again, this one is again a bit of a pick and fight. One that if I had to lean towards someone, much as I rate both men, I'd probably towards Simeon Dennis in this fight. And I think that Simeon Dennis had some really good performances so far, but definitely, not that I know Simeon well, but from like an emotional standpoint, this will be a fight that I think he will be really, really hanging his hat on, being one that he can sort of cement his legacy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I say, again, it's a pick and fight. I mean, I could argue for both of them, to be honest with you. I could argue that, maybe Matt Hilliker's he's going to come in marauding, sort of throwing big shots. We've seen the power. We've also seen that with Simeon Dennis, he's got that slick southpaw style. He can box, he can fight, he can move, he can hold his feet when he wants to. He said he'll do whatever it takes in this fight. But sometimes he can be, I think, a little bit negative in the fact that I think he sort of maybe switches off a little bit and then doesn't, he slightly loses his way. But, from what I've seen of him in the build up to this and talking to him, both of them are very confident that they can win this fight. So it's one of those fights, again, we can argue it whatever way you want. We can find a way to say that Matt Hilliker wins, powerful, strong. He's going to sort of, he's got the sort of the power to stop Dennis. But equally, you could say, well, Dennis has got the skills. He's awkward, he's slick. He's going to make it a hard night's work. So again, it's sit on the fence time. Either one of them could win this. I know what it means to both of them to win this fight. It's a really, really intriguing clash. So there's still more to cover. We'll try and dive through it. Again, upper heavyweight. Now, this is a really interesting one. And we know what boxing is like. It's a cruel, cruel mistress. 1 minute, you're fighting a particular opponent. It's all set. You're training for that opponent. The next minute, bang, injury happens. The fight changes. And you're faced with obviously a new opponent, an unknown, and that is what has happened to Alex Stockley. So Alex Stockley had 2 fights in the competition, great win against Leighton Gronow, and a hard-fought win against Isaac Gibbs last time out. He was due to face Kashif Chowdhury for the regional heavyweight title, a vacant title. It was all set. It looked like a fascinating fight. And then disaster for Kashif Chowdhury. He's damaged his rotator cuff. He's been advised on medical grounds, literally to not do anything, not just box, but work, etc., etc. So, that fight was obviously off. And then in steps former heavyweight title challenger Dave Choppin, who, again, we know really, really well. He's had some great fights, some great performances. He's come up short a couple of times. But for me, when I look at this fight now, I think this is a really, really interesting fight in the fact that Stockley isn't the biggest and he's not the tallest heavyweight. Dave Choppin, when he's sort of in the fights that he's lost previously in title challenges, he's been fighting huge men. And when I say huge, unbelievably tall. He fought the likes of Steve Willis, who was like 6'7", 6'8". He fought Jack O'Sullivan. Now, Jack O'Sullivan beat Choppin to win the novice title. And O'Sullivan, again, 6'6", 6'7", tall, rangy. This isn't the case. Alex Stockley is a lot shorter than these guys. He's obviously Stockley by name. He's stocky by nature. He's a lump. He's muscular. He's strong. He's fast as well. He's not a cumbersome heavyweight. Whereas Dave Choppin, without being disrespectful, he's a plodder, but he's got an unbelievable engine. He keeps throwing punches. When you talk about boxing and the fitness required, yourself, the fitness required to get in there and throw punches. And some people say, oh, it's only 3 2-minute rounds, 4 2-minute rounds. It's such a, I could do that. That's no problem. Put a set of gloves on somebody and tell them to sort of start punching the bag or the pads non-stop for that duration of time. Most people at 30 seconds, 40 seconds will be literally breathing out of their backside. And then you haven't got the nerves of somebody throwing punches back. People don't realise, if you've never boxed, how hard that is. But Choppin has got an unbelievable work rate for a big man. He's heavier. He's going to outweigh Alex Stockley. Normally Choppin has come in anything between sort of 18 to 20 stone in his previous fights. Alex Stockley is not a huge heavyweight. He's going to be around the sort of 15 and a half, maybe 16 stone mark. I saw him and interviewed him a couple of days ago. Looks in terrific shape. He says I've been training unbelievably hard for this fight. But I know even though Choppin is stepping in at late notice, he's been in the gym training alongside Max Chart, his stablemate, Luke Saunders, who's also on the undercard. So it's not like he's been sat at home on the sofa, feet up, eating a pasty, and then suddenly got the call and said, do you fancy fighting? He's been in training. He's been waiting for an opportunity, I'm sure, because these fights do come around where you get that last minute call. And Dave Choppin has said, 100%, I'll fight him. Where is it? When is it? Yep, I'm there. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's a hard one to say. You'd favour Alex Stockley because he's been in camp and because he's been training so hard. But, I wouldn't be surprised if Dave Choppin makes this a really, really tough fight, a much harder fight than Alex Stockley might anticipate. And let's see what Alex Stockley's like. He's sort of he's going to be in for a hard fight. And Choppin's work rate, at that weight as well. I always say this, at heavyweight, one punch can completely change a fight. And regardless of whether people say he's a banger, he's a puncher, if you've got 17, 18, 19 stone behind a punch and you connect with somebody who's walking in and doesn't see a shot, any one of these fighters could be knocked out in the heavyweight division. It's as simple as that. So, yeah, it's one of those fights where you could argue for any of them.
I think when you look at the fact that obviously Dave Choppin has took a lot of fights late notice before, he's took a lot of fights that maybe me as the viewer would perceive him as the underdog in, and he's actually come back from defeat. I've seen fights that he actually got stopped in and he's been calling for a rematch in, and that says a lot about the man's heart and the man's confidence, and the fact that he has tasted defeat before can take a lot of weight off of your shoulders and can let you go into a fight, maybe with an underdog mentality. And it can often draw the best out in fighters. I think a man with nothing to lose is a very, very dangerous man. And that say I was the boxer in question, something I wouldn't really want to be preparing for. I've took a fight at short notice. And I remember the sort of perception you'd have on that is that maybe because I've took it short, so I'm the underdog in the fight. And maybe this was something I used to draw confidence from, and maybe Dave Chopping could draw confidence from, not that you would necessarily need it. But I actually think it makes you more likely to win a fight. I actually think it puts the power in your hands, because all of a sudden, this bloke, look, you might not have been preparing for it, but not preparing for someone, in my opinion, is better than preparing for someone completely different and then having to redirect and reassess everything that you've done in camp. Dave Chopping's always in the gym, surrounded again by good fighters, obviously in the same gym as Max Char. I actually watched Dave Chopping firsthand in sparring in the Light to Box days. And he used to spar with Ricky and Ben Davis, a few sort of veterans of the league, which always gave us really exciting fights, really, really good fighters. And Dave Chopping used to keep coming, try and give as good as he got, and used to keep up with these boys who were obviously a lot lighter than him and were able to have the element of quicker feet against him and things like that. So, and as you say, that work rate, it's a bit of a rarity in a big man. The last thing I'd say to touch on, this is all great on my part, got the fella's name, but like you said, Dave Chopping fighting Steve Willis, who's a mountain of a man, his last opponent we saw him against previously, who was also very tall. One time I do remember Dave Chopping fighting a guy around his height. I can't remember the fella's name, but he was at a Stingray. Obviously, Seb had its old gym and other good fighters, Wolf Griffiths and whatnot. And Dave Chopping got the win on that occasion. Outworked the guy that he boxed, whose name sort of slips my memory. And I remember seeing that guy come along to his sparring trials, which obviously, coach need previous experience. And even then, so you yourself might want to see someone in a sparring trial. And I remember when this heavyweight came on in the sparring trial, and I remember thinking, good boxer, slick, good fighter for someone who's only had a couple of fights. Dave Chopping got a points decision over him. So I think if we were to see Dave Chopping put off what would be perceived as an upset win in this fight,
no, 100%. Yeah, like I say, it's the heavyweights. It's all to play for. Either of them could win. You probably favour, like I say, Stockley because he's the man in form and he's coming into this fight off a long camp. But do not rule out anything when it comes to heavyweight boxing. That's all I can say. So a couple of last fights to talk about. And these are really, really good fights. Now, the one that I'm going to sort of touch on first is light cruiserweights. Morgan Keane up against Richard McKeever, and a very, very fascinating fight. The one thing I will say is, if you haven't seen it, go on to Quest's YouTube channel, type in Legacy. I can't remember whether it's episode 1 or episode 2, but episode 2, Morgan Keane, and you look at that fight and you look at that knockout and tell me if that is not one of the best knockouts either this season or any season. In his last performance, I've got to say, against Brian Turner, unbelievable fight. He's a real talent. He's young, he's exciting, he can bang. I'm excited for this fight. Now, Richard McKeever, again, coming into the competition, he hasn't boxed in Quest before, but he's at that level. It's a great fight stylistically. I know his coach and the gym that McKeever comes out of, and it's a very, very good gym. Joe Miles. I've seen the footage of McKeever outside of Quest, and when I showed that footage to Morgan Keane's team, they said, wow, this is going to be a great fight. They're actually quite similar. They like to draw fighters on. They like to let them sort of come in and then, make them miss, make them pay. But again, two young fighters who really, really want this, who are both going to take this opportunity with both hands. We've seen the power of Morgan Keane. We've also seen with Keane in his first fight against Finn Mitchell that, he can be outworked and outboxed a little bit when he tires. And I think you'll know more about sort of McKeever's gym and what they bring to the table. But again, light cruiserweights, just above light heavyweight. It's a division that isn't in professional boxing, but is in Quest. So, anything up to 13 stone 2. And I think as well, this is another fight that if you don't know anything about them, it's one you're going to watch.
quite often you'll describe a heavyweight as a bit of a plodder, I say. And I think that realistically, as soon as you go up past sort of middleweight, not saying for the most part, but as you go up progressively in the weight divisions, we'll find that fighters are less able to be less able to dance around a ring and move their feet as quick. And that's maybe why, we all rate the likes of Tyson Fury so highly, because you look at him in comparison to, let's say, a Joe Joyce, who's also a brilliant fighter. Footwork is just night and day between the two of them. But when I looked at Morgan Keane's fight, that was one of the first things that struck me, was how quickly he was able to get out of range and out of distance. And when we speak about that knockout in that fight, the reason it was so impressive is they say in boxing, it's the shots you don't see coming. The guy he was fighting steps in, I think for a jab, sits himself down. Morgan Keane, short right hand and puts him on his backside. It's a short shot. It's not drawn back. It doesn't fly over the ring to go with it. One of those short shots that you don't see coming, and it showed to anyone watching that he's got. Then you look at Richard McKeever, and it's not a fighter that I've seen that much of. But like you say, his trainer, Joe Miles, always has his fighters perfectly prepared. I've been lucky enough to do a bit of work with him myself, and I know one thing, when we speak about Keane's power, when you look at Richard McKeever, he's going to have some power going into that. When I was working with Joe Miles, listen, me and you will both know this, I couldn't really punch my way out of a paper bag when I was boxing on the league. I done it right, I won, but was never known as a puncher. And even when I was on the pads, I didn't really feel it. When I used to be taken on the pads by Joe Miles, when I was working with him, straight away, within 2-3 weeks, he was getting me punching 2-3 times as hard as I'd ever been punching before. And I think that that's sort of one of the attributes he's able to get out of his fighters without being solely reliant upon punch power. So I think that without seeing a whole load of McKeever, he's going to give Keane some real problems. And again, keep saying, sound like a broken record, but winners here, we the fans in attendance. Well, two guys going in there who are both well schooled, both able to punch, will both be very confident. Well, that's another thing with fighters coming out of the kick, is there's a really good atmosphere in the gym. Everyone's in sort of, it's almost what we used to call it, like to box doghouse sparring, where you're going to get given half rounds. You might not come out for a break, but 4 different opponents might come in with you at multiple times, and you've got to up your game every 2 minutes to be able to match the levels of intensity that opponent out of each corner is coming in from in sparring. So I think that one thing you can guarantee is you won't get a kicks gym fighter going in there underprepared, all short on confidence. So I think this one, again, has the potential to be a...
Yeah, and I think with boxing, sometimes on these big cards, you've got this marquee main event. You've got the big main event that everybody's talking about. And sometimes you kind of feel like the undercard has just been put on there to kind of pad it out, to put some other fights on the card, and then everybody's really there for just one fight, the main event. Whereas with this card, like I say, we've talked about a number of different fights and why you want to watch them, why they could go either way. It's a 50-50 fight. All of them are 50-50 fights, really. And there's some fascinating matchups, and one that hasn't been publicized really. It's only been added to the card recently, but for me, definitely, I would say the most improved fighter in Quest Boxing League, and one of the most exciting fighters, is the national super featherweight champion. He also won the national lightweight belt last time out in Brighton in the main event, beating your old rival Seb Hallett, is Salah Triple M Bousig. He's originally from Morocco. He now boxes out of the Top Dog boxing gym just outside of Kingston upon Thames. And I've got to say with Salah, I promoted his first ever fight. He was in the gym. His trainer then at the time, a different trainer to his coach now, Mark, sort of called me up and he said, I've got this kid. He's got something about him. He's young, he's exciting, very inexperienced, but he really, really wants to fight. So he boxed a kid called Jay Richardson, who I think you know. Jay Richardson, tough, military, and basically, to cut a long story short, Bousig got stopped in that fight. And it was like, he had something about, you could see he had something about himself. But from that fight, and I was speaking to Bousig recently, and he said, from that fight, I went back to the gym and I trained every day. I trained, I learned, I improved, I listened. You know, he's a total gym rat. And what has subsequently happened is, you know, he's won the national super featherweight title, beating, in my opinion at the time, before that fight happened, the number one in the division, Muhammad Yakubi. It was an unbelievable fight. And obviously Busick won the super featherweight title. He'd also previously lost to Seb Hallett. That was his first fight back after a long layoff. He wanted the rematch, and Hallett's original opponent sort of was injured and couldn't fight. So in steps Salah Busick, not at his natural weight. You know, he went up to 9 stone 9 as opposed to 9 stone 4, which may not sound a lot, but in boxing terms it is. And he went down to Seb Hallett's backyard and boxed again unbelievably and took the decision and beat Seb Hallett. But as I say, unbelievable fighter, exciting fighter, Busick. Now he's fighting a fighter from Manchester called Luke Granger, who's been on the circuit, is very, very well known, is a real talent. But like a lot of fighters, Granger has taken an awful lot of fights outside of his natural weight division. You know, he's campaigned up at 9 stone 9, at 10 stone, and sometimes even higher, just taking fights. Now, I've seen Luke Granger fight, and this kid can fight. He's talented. You know, he's won some big fights recently, and a lot of people say, you know, if you beat Luke Granger, you know, you are a good fighter. You know, there's a number of fighters on the circuit at the moment who are kind of up and coming outside of Quest Boxing League on promotions around the UK who are creating a name for themselves. And Luke Granger, he's a talent. He's a great boxer, and he is naturally, you know, super featherweight. He's coming down from Manchester, and he is coming to win. You know, he's basically saying, you know, this is my big opportunity. Not only am I fighting at my natural weight, I'm fighting somebody who has got the perfect style for me, who I'm excited to fight. And if I come down and I beat Salah Busick at the K2 Arena in Crawley on Quest Boxing League, that's my springboard. That's going to announce me, you know, on the circuit, because, you know, Quest is such a well-known platform. You know, people will see this fight and they'll really take notice. So, you know, I know you've got a connection to, you know, Busick really, really well. You know, you've trained out of the same gym that Busick trains out of. You've seen the performances. You've seen how much he's come on. You probably haven't seen an awful lot of Granger, but there's a lot of him on YouTube. So although this fight is kind of like it's been made late notice, I think as well, this is another fight for the fans that is going to be a barnstormer.
Yeah, I mean, the way you described Salah there as the most improved fighter you've seen on the league at the moment, I couldn't have put it much better myself, because I actually boxed again on the same night that Salah fought Jay Richardson. I think it was 2018. Quite a few boxed on that night. Obviously, Salah got dropped and stopped in that fight. And I could be forgiven for sort of after that fight thinking, okay, maybe we won't see much more of him, sort of thing. And then I actually met Salah myself. And now, to current day, I've sparred hundreds around Salah. But yeah, so I met Salah straight away. One thing is like, he's got an aura about him. He's got a heart of iron, Salah. And he's relentless in his quest to get better and better and better. Salah's one of these fighters that he's improving at such a fast rate. I used to, as I say, I didn't used to think I was much of a puncher, but I used to think I was a good boxer. I used to pride myself on that, and I'd go in and spar with Salah, and I'd think, right, I'm gonna be able to outbox him here. And Salah has an absolute brilliant knack of being able to draw you into an absolute. When it comes to having him, there ain't many tougher than Salah, you know. He's out of a really good gym, Top Dog Boxing. He's got a really, really good coach in Mark Fitch, who's obviously well-schooled in the competition, has had loads of boys and girls, including Neve Morris, a really good fighter, come in and go on the shows. Kai Christie, another one, Adam Smith, all actively fighting on the shows at the minute and performing really well. And that's a massive credit to Mark, Salah's coach. In terms of Salah himself, I could have never foreseen the level that Salah was going to get to, because I didn't know him personally well enough to know that he'd have that drive and that ambition to continue improving, to work so hard, and technically so far advanced. Saw early on in the
competition.
Other thing, when I say to having that heart, you know, it's one thing getting in the ring. It takes a lot of bottle to. Some people that haven't boxed might think, what difference? But it takes even more bottle to then go and win them. And that might sound a bit weird to some people because they'd think, well, you're in the ring, of course you're trying to win it. I'm telling you now, there's places to hide in that. Salah is a fighter, does not hide. He comes out, throws hell for leather. He'll go out on his shield, as shown previously if he needs to, and he will make things a real fight. He's avenged losses now to Jay Richardson in a rematch, Seb Hallett in a rematch. So he's shown so many layers to his game now. And in what I would say, a very unexpected way, not now we know how good he is. Cast your mind back a couple of years ago, in a very unexpected way, he's become one of the best fighters on the league. Definitely, probably the leading fighter in and around that weight division. And obviously, they're still sort of fascinating fights through. I know a lot of people want to see the trilogy with Seb Hallett. If the score's 1-1, it makes sense to do that fight again. And that would be one I'd be massively eager to see again. But you can't overlook the opponent he's got because, like you say, I think he fought on the last show, didn't he?
No, he's not fought on. This is his debut in Quest, but he has, like I say, he's boxed on the circuit. He's very, very well known. And I think, there's a lot of fighters across, when you look at the sort of the scene across the UK, there are an awful lot of really, really talented fighters who are, boxing tends to be quite sort of promotionally territorial. So, Quest is obviously, most of our shows are sort of London and the southeast, all the way down to Brighton. There are going to be shows moving outside of that area and sort of up and down the country, but you tend to stick to the promotion that's closest to home, because as a boxer, you're there, your fan base is there, you're selling tickets, some boxers will travel all over the country, but you tend to stay within the promotions that are in your local area. And there's some great promotions across the UK, week in, week out, fights going on, great fights that, as far as fans are going to see, there's some unbelievable fighters out there. But the quest for Quest, pardon the pun, is to get these fighters to face each other, and the best face the best, whether you're from Manchester, Newcastle, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Leeds, wherever. There are so many talented fighters out there in these divisions. And when these fighters, go head to head, you then start to find out the levels, of who is the best in the division, who's the best in the country. And that's from all weight divisions. And I get sort of videos sent to me all the time of, young, hungry, talented fighters who have made a name for themselves outside of Quest, who want to come into the Quest competition. And that's not to say that Quest is the best competition out there. There's loads of great shows, but people tend to want to gravitate and test themselves because there's a lot of publicity about Quest and the sort of across the socials and the TV, etc., etc. So it's kind of seen as a platform where if I can get on that and be seen, that could be my springboard to, to big things. And I think Luke Granger sees that if he can come down from Manchester, if he can come down and beat Salah Busic, who's, like we said, is seen as, the most improved, the most exciting fighter, that's a big statement. And I will say, credit to Salah Busic, because he's taking on somebody who he doesn't have to fight. He could have just basically sat back, waited. There's a number of fights out there. Like you say, you mentioned the Seb Hallett trilogy fight. There's also former British champion Dexter Horton, who has said, I'll get down to 9-4. I want to fight Salah Busic. There's other fighters out there. There's a couple of fighters outside of Quest at the moment. One called Jay Marley, who I think he's 20-0. I mean, I think he's a young fighter, but he's boxed on lots of different promotions around the UK. And he's apparently the one to beat at super featherweight. There's so many fights, but
imagine a fight between Salah and Daryl.
Yeah,
That'd be a good fight. Daryl Goddard, that is a fighter that used to fight, very good fighter. He used to fight on your shows. That'd be a fight between those two.
Yeah,
get him Finley if he was to come back. The fights there for Salah. There's so many.
There's so many good fights, and like I say, my point is he doesn't have to fight Luke Granger, but Salah wants to fight, wants to stay active, wants to stay busy, wants to improve, and that's the one thing with boxing that I'll say outside of Quest. There is far too much of this golden O, this undefeated record, this fighters and trainers protecting these records and creating this aura of invincibility around their fighter and saying, oh, well, he's undefeated. You know, he's had this many fights, he's undefeated. And the problem with that is that that's great. It looks good. I mean, as a promoter, you know, there's nothing easier than promoting a fighter who's undefeated, who's had win after win after win. But when you look on their resume and look at the fighters that they fought, and you genuinely, and this goes for sort of pro boxing, and you know how pro boxing works. You know, the prospects are given fights to build up their confidence. It's not like you're thrown straight in and say, if you're good enough to turn pro, you're good enough to fight anybody. No. There is a sort of a learning process and a feeling out process, like with every single champion. They've had to go through those learning fights. But you get records that are padded. You look at the records and you think, yeah, I mean, on paper, he looks fantastic. You know, he's had this many fights, he's had this many wins, he's had this many knockouts. With Quest and a lot of other promotions outside of the pro ranks, you know, there are loads and loads of good fighters who have losses on their records who are now champions. And it's because they don't duck, they don't avoid, they fight who's put in front of them. And a lot of these guys who've got the attitudes like, I'm just there to fight. Same with the UFC, for example. Outside of boxing, the champions that are in UFC, you know, there aren't many undefeated UFC champions who have not got a blemish on their record. At some stage, they've tasted defeat and they've come back. Does it make them a lesser fighter? Absolutely not. How can you go through a career? I kind of got off piste a little bit here, but how can you go through a career and turn up and fight and be your peak, your best every single time? It's impossible. You know, as a fighter, that you'll go through camp and you might have an injury, you might have a cold, you might not be quite feeling it. You might have things going on outside of the ring that have detracted from that concentration. You turn up and suddenly somebody goes, oh, well, he lost. He couldn't have been that good. But you don't see the backstory. You don't see the layers that have led to that loss. But a padded record of undefeated fighters means nothing. What we're talking about here and across not just the Busick versus Granger fight, but across all the fights, it's the best fighting the best. The record doesn't mean anything. It's about putting on fights that you look at and go, that would be a good fight. And not only on this event coming up on September the 30th, November the 18th at the Epsom Downs Racecourse, the 2023 season finale. I promise you this, there are going to be some announcements of fights made in the next week or so that people who know Quest and know these fighters are going to look at and go, oh my God, that fight, that one fight is one I want to go and see. But there is a whole card of them, of fighters from established champions to new fighters who have just arrived on the scene. It's going to be unbelievable. But I think, you know, we've covered the fights. If you stayed long enough to watch this, then thank you very much, because, you know, we have gone on and we've sort of, it has taken some time. But as I say, Saturday, September the 30th, the K2 Arena in Crawley. The main event is worth the admission price alone. You know, Lee Cannon, Max Chart, you know, the super middleweight title is on the line. All these other fights we've talked about. Plus, we've not even scratched the surface with the undercard, the non-title action, with some great fighters on this bill that, you know, there's some really, really good fights on that. So, you know, I hope you've enjoyed this sort of, this breakdown, this sort of preview. Like I say, it is going to be an unbelievable fight. And as I say, Joey, great to see you. I know you're going to be ringside next Saturday to be there to watch it. We're going to do a sort of an after the bell where we review all these fights that we've talked about and more. We're going to be sort of reviewing them and sort of talking about what actually went down, whether we were right, whether we were wrong, who won, upsets, knockouts, etc., etc. I know we'll be talking about it. So, like I say, that is it. This is After the Bell. This is the preview to Night of Destiny on the 30th of September. It's going to be an unbelievable night of boxing, and I hope you can join us.